Welcome to Web3 Watchdogs, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of Web3 security, compliance, and risk. Join Michael Pearl as he interviews executives from across the Web3 industry to uncover the challenges and opportunities of this rapidly evolving space. Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by CISOs, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. CISOs harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Web3 Watchdogs, the podcast that focuses on everything security, fraud prevention, compliance, risk management, basically everything that is interesting in the Web3 space and has to do with safety and security. And today we have a very interesting guest. He is kind of an OG of the cybersecurity space in Web3, J.M Porup. He is currently the CISO, the Chief Information and Security Officer at Berachain, and he has an extensive background in the crypto space in various security positions. JM, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. That's a very flattering introduction.
Yeah, just to be honest, we've been waiting for a while to talk to you, and it's a pleasure for us. So why don't we just dive right in? Tell us about yourself, about your background. Just one comment. Previously, you were the Chief Information Security Officer for Avalabs, and you have a very extensive background, as I said. So please tell us about yourself.
Yeah, well, again, I appreciate the invite. I've been in and around cybersecurity for 20 plus odd years. I was CISO at Avalabs for 3 years. That's correct. I'm currently CISO at Berachain. And I would say what I'm interested in as a crypto CISO is because I come from a traditional off-chain Web2 enterprise security background. What interests me is not so much smart contract security, as vital and important as that is, but rather the large blind spot I see for many crypto companies who are neglecting their Web2 security. But we see the significant security risk of Web2 compromise leading to Web3 impact. The Bybit Safe hack in February, for example, is a classic case of Web2 compromise with catastrophic Web3 security impact.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And obviously, we'll dive into that a little bit later. May I just add another layer? As you mentioned, the Web2 originated hacks, and you mentioned the on the Web3 level, you mentioned the audits of smart contracts. And may I add on top of that that even if you are handling the Web2 side of things and you're auditing your smart contracts, still you're not sealing yourself 100% from being hacked, because audits can only go that much. We all know about the Euler case where they spent maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars on audits with various providers, different providers, that some of them audited, a smart contract, several providers per one smart contract, right? So eventually it didn't really help them. And on top of that, you need to have a real-time layer of protection, such as monitoring, such as response mechanisms, and so on.
The cyber's pitch. Well, look, I mean, we have to acknowledge that it's a fair point. There's no such thing as perfect security, and there's no such thing as a perfect security audit. Any honest security auditor who's being honest with you will tell you, I mean, I did the best job I could. I cannot guarantee you the absence of error in either the code or my audit. In Web 2, we roll with that and focus on resilience because we can have rolling patches pushed on a moment's notice, but the generally immutable nature of on-chain smart contracts really requires you to front load application security. And even then, as you fairly point out, you can never have 100% confidence that your Web 2 or Web 3 stack is ironclad. That simply doesn't exist. Absolutely true.
Yeah, totally agree. And right now you're at Berachain. So Berachain, me personally, I've seen Berachain at quite a few conferences, primarily in the States. And I know that Berachain is right now is really scaling and growing. But please tell us in your own words, what is Berachain all about? And maybe give us some figures about the projects that are building on top of it, TVL and so on?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, my job function isn't BD, so I don't have every stat at my fingertips. But look, I mean, Berachain has implemented a novel proof of liquidity mechanism, and I would say, we don't aim to be a ghost chain. Our goal is to build a real business, to bring real off-chain businesses on-chain, where end users don't even realize they're using a blockchain. That's really the end goal. Like we don't aim to be, the ghost chain or a speculation only coin. Like we're here for the long haul, bringing real businesses on chain. If I had to name our flagship ecosystem success so far, probably Puffpaw. Puffpaw is a vape company that pays you to consume less nicotine, and they have made an incredibly popular business doing so. And end users, you know, are really enjoying it. Many actually quit smoking and make money in the process. So there's all sorts of interesting edge cases where blockchain has real world business value. And Berachain is very much focused on working with real world off chain businesses to find blockchain use cases. And I think we have a long list of ecosystem partners in the wings ready to go public over the course of the next 6 months. And I will let everyone follow the news to see how that goes.
Great. So, given the fact that you're not a BD, I'm not going to ask you to give us the full pitch of Berachain. But nevertheless, one of the, let's say, bullet points of a usual, pitch of a blockchain, whether it's L1 or L2, is
Mm,
usually the security part. So,
mm,
obviously, quite a few chains are showcasing their security, saying that they are the most secured or close to it. What can you tell us about Berachain? I'm not going to go into the discussion of whether you're the most secure chain and so on. I'm just interested in understanding how did you or your predecessor plan this chain to be secured? What makes it secure? And obviously, don't give us the secret sauce so nobody can take advantage of it.
Well, look, I would say that the co-founders of Berachain deeply appreciate the importance of de-risking their business from a security point of view, and they have, even before I joined Berachain, front-loaded substantial resources to de-risk the code we publish. In terms of chain components, like we have preferred to take battle-tested components like Cosmos and Geth and Reth and essentially use existing battle tested Lego blocks to build something unique and novel, as opposed to rewriting something completely novel from scratch, which has huge security risk. Proof of liquidity itself is not a gigantic amount of software, and it's heavily vetted by very very good people. Again, I don't want to get into the details, so I would say, financial incentives drive security, and I believe that, the owners of this company have invested substantial and meaningful resources to de-risk our security risk as much as is humanly possible. And of course, we don't make 100% guarantees about anything, because that would be fraudulent. Like we take extraordinary efforts, and I think that is a fair and true thing to say.
Yeah, and when you say that it's essentially kind of a Lego components, if I understand correctly, you mean that, let's say, in the wild west of Ethereum, for instance, you
Mm,
can build basically whatever you want. So let's say if you want to build a staking contract, you
mm,
can build it, basically any way you want it to be, right, in the boundaries of what the Ethereum blockchain allows you to, and
mm,
then essentially you can have different vulnerabilities or different problems in your code,
mm,
or you can leave loose ends like proxies and so on.
mm,
So if I understand correctly, when you say that you have kind of Lego blocks modules,
mm.
essentially you have ready functions that you can take and use within your stack, and those functions are already verified and vetted and so on.
Let me give you a specific example before we move on. Like we use Go Ethereum. We are an Ethereum compatible blockchain, and we're an EVM compatible blockchain. Now, Go Ethereum has been extraordinarily battle tested over the last 10 years. We don't have to independently security audit Go Ethereum. That doesn't make sense, right? And so is Go Ethereum 100% secure? Of course not. But do we have confidence that it's been thoroughly de-risked by the Ethereum ecosystem? Well, I think that would indeed be a fair and true thing to say.
Got it. Just to pick up on what we started from, where you kind of gave your philosophy about Web3 security. I've been in this space for about a decade, and even before I started dealing with security and was, working with other companies that are not necessarily cybersecurity providers, I always heard about security as being the top hurdle for, the growth and the adoption of this ecosystem.
Mhm.
And always people say that security is going to be solved eventually, it's going to get better. And, here we are after the Bybit hack. And if you think that it's only the centralized exchanges, we had quite a few hacks, even in this quarter of this year on smart contract platforms and projects and so on. So, what does it entail to make a significant change to make this ecosystem, this industry, more secure? Because we've seen kind of incremental movements, but then again, the hackers, they have maybe far faster and far more revolutionary changes in terms of their technology and their resources. So
Mhm.
eventually, you see that we're staying in the same place, or even our position is worsening with respect to security.
Look, I think that a temptation for many people is to throw up your hands in despair and engage in security nihilism. And I think that's the wrong way to approach things. Um, no, perfect security is not possible. Real risk mitigation is possible. I look back 5 years ago to when I first started working in crypto, and rubber stamp security audits were extremely common. People didn't understand that, bad smart contracts will get exploited. So they would get a $15,000 rubber stamp security audit to show their VCs, and they'd roll the prod, they'd hockey stick to $20 million and get wrecked 2 months later. And the 2 years preceding DeFi summer, I think we saw a lot of that. And I think collectively, both investors and startup founders collectively came to the realization that, wow, we actually have to spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on application security as a minimal viable hurdle to go to market. And I think today in 2025, nobody would disagree with that statement. 5 years ago, I think they would. Yeah. So I see that as a major step forward. And I think the Bybit Safe hack, which was a combination of poor Web2 security on the part of Safe, no EDR, endpoint device security, CI/CD pipeline security, and poor operational security on the part of Bybit, that combination turned out to be bad. But that really, like the conversations I have with industry partners since February, people have woken up to the gigantic blind spot they have in terms of Web2 security. Now, people are still figuring it out. All of a sudden, there's a mushrooming cottage industry of CISOs offering a extremely variable service. Some of them good, some of them terrible. But the conversation is happening. People are realizing we can't just be like, YOLO on chain, ignore endpoint device security, avoid, the basics of Web2 security, because that leads to Web3 compromise. And I expect that conversation to continue over the next 18 to 36 months. And again, the point is not perfection. If you expect perfection, you will always be disappointed. The point is to have real, meaningful, measurable security risk mitigation. And as long as you choose to live in the real world and seek to reduce your risk and not to eliminate your risk, then I think you can achieve that goal. And, business taking risks is part of business. Like, you're not going to say, you go to market, there's the risk your competition destroys you. Okay, well, you still go to market. There is the chance that an arbitrary regulator regulates you out of business. Well, you hire a lawyer and you still go to market. There's risks everywhere you turn in business. So the point is to mitigate risk, not to be like, crazy security thing, I don't get it, I'm just going to give up, lie down, and die, because that's just stupid.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, so you are a CISO of a chain, and I can assume that most of the chains have such a position, such a function. Maybe not all of them, but at least the more prominent ones. And once they start accruing,
Mm,
TVL, eventually they will hire someone to fulfill this role.
mm,
But the projects that you meet, the
mm,
projects that are active on Berachain or want to be active on Berachain, how often do you see a counterpart that you can actually work with versus seeing someone that, yeah, I'm the CEO, I'm the CTO, and I'm the CISO, or we have some junior guy that is doing, QA, and he's also the head of security, right? Because I've seen quite a few of those, and I'm just curious about how you see it from your point of view.
Look, I can't speak to the security posture of my ecosystem partners. I think that would be a breach of confidentiality. But I can say that in general, security spend needs to be commensurate with the value secured. You don't buy an expensive safe and keep it empty. You buy an expensive safe because you have a gigantic diamond you don't want robbed. You don't hire bodyguards for somebody who's not famous. There's no risk, right? So security spend has to be proportionate to the things secured. And so if you're an early stage startup, you're not going to spend $1 million on security. If your burn rate is like, you've got 250K in, right? So I think it's very important to be thinking about, security asymmetries in terms of spend to get results, because there's always going to be not enough money and too much risk. So I think there's good reasons why smaller companies may not have a full-time security hire. It may not, security is a function of finance. End of the day, my job function is a function of finance. The more you have to secure, the more security you need. And finance drives that conversation. Even if it's a regulatory compliance thing, the risk of regulatory fines is a financial impact that drives the security conversation. So everything about security is driven by finance. And so having proportionate security at your stage of growth, finding asymmetric ways to get risk mitigation at a cheap price. And then if you can't find or don't have the budget for a full-time CISO, which many don't in good faith. And, I'm not going to criticize an early stage startup for not having a full-time security hire. Like, that could be a very reasonable choice. Then maybe you're outsourcing, you have a consultant or 10 hours a week vCISO or whatever makes sense for you for your specific business and your specific use case.
So that's a very fair point. I totally understand why some companies do not need to hire CISOs until they reach a certain, threshold. But having said that, I can imagine that, you mentioned Bybit, right? And I can imagine that they did have a CISO and they had a VP security and a director of security, and they probably were allocating millions of dollars on security, whether it's infrastructure and manpower and practices and so on and so forth. And yet here we are, right? And you've mentioned, the fault from their end, and we can say the same thing about Safe as well, which is called Safe, right? And eventually they have a very prominent cybersecurity experts. And at the end of the day, those two platforms were compromised and $1.5 billion were stolen. So just to kind of continue your point from beforehand, even when you allocate the resources and the funds and you hire the right people, it is still not enough, right? Because we see that even for those types of companies, eventually they have a weak spot, whether it's, just from becoming too accustomed to move $1.5 billion every day or even twice a day, or maybe through some real vulnerabilities that they were blind to. Am I right about that?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, let's have a fact check here. Safe has not been very forthcoming with a post-mortem. I don't know what their staffing looks like. I honestly don't know. What does their security team look like? I don't know. So I definitely cannot comment on that. Now, certainly, what we do know suggests that a developer's laptop was compromised that led to compromised CI/CD pipeline publishing malicious front-end code. That is all that I know. If there's additional details I've missed, but from what I've been able to glean from the internet, that's all I know. Like, I don't have greater insight into the inner workings of Safe. So there's definitely, I don't know all the facts. But based on the facts I know, that suggests North Korea's malware game is not top tier. I feel like reasonable EDR and lockdown CI/CD pipeline at a fairly minimal level would have prevented that. Now, again, that is conjecture.
Maybe
I don't know all the facts of the case, right? So there's some benefit of the doubt here. I don't know what actually happened.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but just before you go on, maybe I can stop you at that point, and for the sake of our listeners who are perhaps not familiar with EDR and the other terms, if you
Hmm.
can elaborate in layman's terms, what does it mean, and how can you work on that?
Sure. EDR, endpoint detection and response. It's essentially third, fourth generation antivirus. It's essentially scanning all files, processes on a laptop, looking for signs of malicious compromise. So, while EDR, again, nothing's perfect, EDR isn't perfect. Certainly, garden variety or known malware would be picked up by, CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, something like this, right? Um, so, again, is it possible that Safe had all those things in place and somehow it still got through? Yes, it is hypothetically possible. I don't know with certainty the facts of the case. However, given the sums of money involved, it does raise questions, right? Like, I feel like there's an open question as to exactly how diligent Safe was in this instance. Now, maybe they come out and publish a post-mortem proving me wrong, and that's also possible. I don't know. And Bybit, like Bybit is an actual exchange. I would strongly conjecture they have a strong Web2 security team, and they may have committed some operational security mistakes. They could have run their own safe front end, for instance, right? That I'm sure an exchange has enough resources to stand up their own safe front end and do that in house. They don't have to use an outsourced safe front end, for instance, right? Um, so look, mistake, but I think perhaps the bigger point that you want to make, and that I would agree with, is that nothing's perfect, and there's always the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And I would classify, for both Safe and Bybit, this was a known unknown risk, and neither of them saw coming. And now I think there's lessons learned there from both companies' mistakes that we can take to avoid both repeating those mistakes and also to avoid making other kinds of mistakes just by being perhaps a little bit more careful and a little bit more paranoid in general.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And just to continue on your point with respect to Web2 vulnerabilities, or rather threats from the Web2 side of things.
Mm,
So, after your fascinating explanation, and I think I've learned a lot from it about what happened behind the Bybit hack, and you
mm,
said you gave your disclaimer that you don't know everything, and obviously nobody knows everything. I do agree with you that the publications from both sides were quite laconic and quite short, and I tried to read every word to figure out what that means. But having said that, we do understand that in cases of centralized exchanges, the Web2 element is crucial, and that could be kind of the source of the threat. Oftentimes, actually, in our data at Cyverse, we see that about 80% of Web3 incidents originated from Web2. So that
yes.
supports your
That is a
claim.
commonly cited statistic. Now, is it exactly 80% and not
Yeah,
79 or 81? But the point being, like, Web 2 as a threat vector to steal Web 3 funds is far more common than many Web 3 founders and users realize.
yeah. So I totally agree with that. But when we're talking about DeFi specifically,
Mm,
does Web2 originated threats affect the DeFi space? And just to kind of further clarify my question, if I build a smart contract, which is, as you said, and as we all know, is immutable, right?
mm,
Essentially, my front end and my kind of Web2 element of this service
mm,
is not that relevant for that, right? I can
mm,
trick, let's say, I can do some sort of a sophisticated phishing scheme where
mm,
I can trick someone to connect their wallet and then drain their wallet.
mm.
But when it comes to draining the actual smart contract, does it also have in any way, shape, or form a Web2 element to it?
Well, I mean, there's the deployment process. If somehow the smart contract developer deploying the contract on chain during the deployment process, but it is possible to verify the bytecode post deployment to ensure that the build and deployment process has not been tampered with. But certainly, in terms of like end user laws, this is why we talk about hardware wallets for end users. If you're using a hot wallet with substantial sums of funds, that's a Web2 security risk, right? Compromised laptop results in loss of funds. Or hardware wallet with a front end or that a compromised laptop that gaslights you into signing something also results in loss of funds. So that turns into more of a decentralized endpoint security risk as opposed to a on-chain security risk.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And following what we talked about with respect to how many, let's say, resources you allocate to security and whom do you hire for security roles and so on. So
Mm,
right now we're only talking kind of on a libertarian level of, the financial gain of the company and so on.
mhm,
But as we know, let's say in the TradFi world,
mhm,
security is not something that is up to the decision of, the CEO or the founder and so on. It is something that oftentimes is kind of directed by the regulators and by even by legislation in some cases. So let's say in the EU we have DORA, right,
mhm,
which is quite kind of very wide and general, but still
mhm,
gives you some sort of boundaries into what you have to have in terms of
mhm,
your security stack. And we also have the standards, right? We have the CCSS and we have the kind of more traditional ISO and so on
mhm.
that basically dictates some basic ground rules into what you're supposed to have in terms of security. What's your take on it? I'm not giving my personal opinion here. I'm just saying that you have different approaches, right? You have the regulatory approach, you have the kind of self-regulation standards, or maybe nothing. What's your take on it?
Look, first of all, I'm not a lawyer. However, I do know a great deal about cybersecurity regulatory compliance. And I would say, the reason that cybersecurity regulation exists is because of the negative externalities of data breaches. What is a negative externality? Let's say I have a database with 100 million lines of PII. Let's say the government of North Korea steals a copy of my database. I, as a company, have not been harmed. I have experienced zero financial injury. In fact, I continue to monetize that data. I mean, they're not my customers, they're my product. It's surveillance capitalism, right? But now, North Korea can harm my users' product customers. Now, when the news comes out, there's bad PR. I might get a regulatory fine. Maybe my CEO gets hauled before Congress. End result, price goes up, stock goes up, CEO gets a bonus, pay a small fine, cost of doing business, right? This is how data breach regulation works in the 2020s. Yeah. So, and even with compliance, like if you talk to lawyers, lawyers themselves will take a risk based approach. How likely is it will even be audited or enforced? You know what? We're just going to cut corners. We're not going to do the things we're legally obligated to do because, well, what's the odds of getting caught? And if we do get caught, we'll accept the risk of paying a fine if we do get caught. Now, again, I don't recommend that approach, but I merely observe that to be a true thing. That is how lawyers in industry discuss cybersecurity regulatory compliance. Why should we spend a ton of money if the actual risk, like I know a guy who models mathematically the risk of GDPR fines. And if you model the likelihood of GDPR enforcement versus the size of the possible fine, he showed me the math. Like, it's better not to be compliant. It's cheaper in the long run because statistically you won't get enforced. And if you do get enforced, the cost over time amortized of the fine is cheaper than being compliant. Right. So instead of taking, North Korea as your adversary, you're taking an underfunded regulator as your adversary, and you care only about the financial impact of regulation because that's what for-profit companies in a capitalist society do.
Mhm.
Now let's rewind that scenario. Instead of 100 million lines of PII, we have $100 million of fungible, non-reversible cryptocurrency. North Korea steals the cryptocurrency. Now, what is the financial impact of this security incident? I have just lost $100 million. That is not a negative externality. That is a negative internality, if you'll permit the wordplay. It is immediate financial harm. So, what is more important? Okay, lost $100 million. Now, Mr. Regulator, you're going to fine me $200,000. You're going to fine me $200,000 after I just lost $100 million. Ooh, that's really going to incentivize me to be more secure. No. It makes no sense. It makes no sense because in crypto, the financial impact of actual loss is orders of magnitude greater than the potential impact of regulatory fines or bad PR. So what this means is, how do you regulate that? Well, You don't, because it doesn't make sense. Now,
Just to counter that a little bit, I agree and disagree. Why? Because first of all, I agree that the immediate, as you called it, internality, right? The financial loss
Mm,
is far greater than the fine that you're supposed to get. And I will just add on top of that that usually, and we are in touch with the companies that are getting hacked, unfortunately.
mm,
And you see that basically the cost that you see and that you read in the media is only part of the equation,
mm,
because there's the damage to the reputation,
mm,
and if you stop withdrawals in the case of a centralized exchange, there are
mm,
huge financial losses. And then
mhm,
there is also, if you have a token, the token is going to lose significantly, in some cases never to recover, right?
mhm,
And in some cases just plummet straight to zero. Again, it changes between different use cases, and it very much depends on how deep of pockets you have, because in the case of Bybit, they were able to internalize the loss as high as it may be and eventually come out of it maybe even stronger, right?
mm.
But it's not the case for all projects and all centralized exchanges. But just to counter that, until now I was supporting your claim, right? So just to slightly counter that, I think the only way that a regulatory enforcement
Mm.
can harm you even more than the financial one is if you have your license revoked in some jurisdiction. Right? So
Sure.
if you're building a market, and that hasn't happened until now, it might happen.
Sure, like, I mean, if you're operating under NYDFS, NYDFS doesn't fuck around, right? But, if you're specifically going for NYDFS licensing, then you're ready to spend $5 million up front getting licensed. And really, the only reason to follow, regulatory compliance obligations is as a prerequisite to do business, or because you want to be a vendor to a regulated business, in which case you're going to do your SOC 2 or your I 27001. A hot tip. You know how you get your SOC 2? I accept the risk. I accept the risk. I accept the risk. I accept the risk. Do nothing. Boom. SOC 2 done. You're audited. No security at all, and you have your SOC 2, right? So these are the little games we play, and I think it's really important, and because this is a very common mistake among non-security listeners and readers, is that compliance and security are not the same thing. Compliance is legal bullshit paperwork to make the lawyers go away and to enable your business. And real security is realpolitik on the fifth domain against extra legal, extrajudicial adversaries who don't give the money back and where there's no legal recourse whatsoever.
That's well said. Well said. So unfortunately, we're approaching the end of the show. Time really flies by, JM, and it was quite a conversation out there. My final question to you would be kind of gazing into the future and building up on the latest trend with respect to stablecoins, and then some after the Genius Act was passed.
Mm,
So if all the pundits are correct, we're about to see a huge influx of stablecoins, maybe in some cases some stablecoins that we haven't seen so far. So essentially, as you said, if you tick
mhm,
several boxes, then you can become a stablecoin issuer. And basically, this industry is set to grow and expand. And I know that whatever happened in the US with respect to the Genius Act
mm,
already starts, scaling and spreading around the world with more coherent regulation.
mhm.
So if we take that into account, and we'll see tons of new stablecoins that will be much more widely adopted, what are we expect to see in terms of security risks? How should we treat them? What should those issuers and the custodians and all the other, elements of this ecosystem be minded about?
Well, I think I have two thoughts to that question. The first is that it's important to understand that stablecoins have very different security properties because they are centralized coins. If you are a Circle or a stablecoin issuer, you can revoke coins. It is not a decentralized system. The issuer has complete control, and it is, let's be honest, the first step towards a CBDC. The ultimate goal is the Fed. Like China just issued their first stablecoin or announced it a couple days ago, right? It's like a situation where it is a centralized, controlled coin. So it's not like, if someone commits fraud, there will eventually be ways where you can go to Circle or the stablecoin issuer and say, just revoke the coin, give it back to me. That's not reality today, but I think that's the direction we're headed, where we have centralized policing of theft by the stablecoin issuer. But I think more broadly speaking, the problem is that Web2 and Web3 security are merging. And that ought to scare the hell out of Web2 companies because we're talking about compliance, but most TradFi businesses have pretty mediocre security for the very reason they're dealing with fungible, reversible assets. And their primary adversary is the regulator. So they don't need to have massive security controls. But now when we start integrating, like I did take the about a month ago, hackers broke into a vendor serving Brazil's central bank and they stole almost $200 million USD. What did they do? They immediately bridged into crypto and disappeared, you know, using various accounts on crypto exchanges in Latin America. And that money's not coming back. They stole fiat, switched to crypto within 3 hours, boom, it's gone. Never getting it back. Never, ever getting that money back. It's in Bitcoin and Ethereum, and it's not coming back, period, right? And I think banks and TradFi need to wake up to that because you know what I mean when I say Web3 operates in a very high security environment. If you fuck around, you will find out. And
Yeah.
and my concern is what it is, right? And my concern is that Web2 companies are not prepared. If you've got an 80,000 seat Windows fleet, with Active Directory, it's one domain admin away from stealing all of your money. And that's crazy because they're not ready for it. Web3 has a blind spot on Web2, but Web2 has a gigantic blind spot on Web3. Up until now, it's been ransomware. We're going to hold your data hostage in exchange for Bitcoin. But that's just the appetizer. What's going to come next is going to seriously challenge how TradFi thinks about security. And it's going to be very painful to watch.
That's fascinating. Can you give me kind of your worst case scenario example of what may happen? Let's say fast forward 2-3 years from now, we have huge adoption of stablecoins, as you said, the new CBDCs. I do agree to that analysis. What
Mhm.
can we expect? Without naming names, just in theory.
I mean, it's very difficult to think 3 years ahead in crypto. A year in crypto is the same as a decade anywhere else, as the saying goes. Look, I think two things come to mind. One, what happened in Brazil can happen at even bigger scale. Like I have to compare it to the Bangladesh Swift hack of 2016. They got most of the money back. Most of the money got blocked. The Swift system is robust and resilient against even that kind of heist. Crypto is not, right? So the idea of a repeat of the Bangladesh Swift heist, someone steals $10 billion and it goes immediately to Bitcoin and Ethereum and it's gone forever, right? And I think that's going to happen over and over again. But I also think our endpoint devices are not optimized for storing fungible value. They're optimized for data privacy, which again, nobody cares about. And the government and corporations like to spy on. But when we have, because once we have stable coins on everyone's phones, for instance, now stable coins are going to have that, central policing mechanism. But after that, those same wallets are going to be used for Ethereum and Bitcoin and decentralized stores of value. And a hot wallet on a phone is fundamentally unsuitable for secure storage of fungible, non-reversible stores of value. So there's going to have to be a collective awakening that the security of these devices is not sufficient for money. And that's either going to require widespread adoption of hardware wallets that are like current hardware wallets suck. I'm sorry. Like they don't scale. Like you need a hardware wallet that looks like the first generation iPod. It is so easy to use, right? It has to be that brain dead simple. That doesn't exist today. So it's either there's like the iPod generation 1 moment for hardware wallets, or there's going to have to be like massive investment in security at Apple and Google. And what does the future hold? We'll
Or
find out.
maybe some biometric elements that allow you to authorize transactions or things of that sort.
Maybe, but there's proven attacks against biometrics, and once someone steals your face, you can't rotate your face. You can't
Yeah.
rotate your fingerprint. So and, given the inability to perfectly execute on biometrics, it does work at scale, but it doesn't work perfectly at scale. And there's no resilience if someone steals a copy of your face or your fingerprint. And think about how good cameras and AI are getting. Like I can look at a group photo, steal someone's face eventually, and use that to access their account. So I don't know that biometrics is going to be the way forward. It might be part of it. I don't know.
Yeah, and just to add to what you were saying, I think also that one of the big promises of this stablecoin adoption is the interoperability between other tokens, stablecoins, and eventually fiat. Right? The whole idea that all this will be seamless. So you mentioned that with Berachain, in some cases, you don't even know that you're on the blockchain, right? As an end user. So the vision for stablecoins, at least the way that the pundits are calling it, is that you will have this seamless interoperability between the three. And what you just said with respect to stealing fiat and being able to on-ramp very quickly and then maybe to swap it to different tokens, different chains, and so on, and just run away, that sounds to me like a huge risk that should be addressed.
I fear that's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah. On this optimistic note, we'll end the show. JM, it was a real treat. I want your obligation on camera right now that you're going to come back very soon to continue this conversation. Perhaps when we have some more insights on the stable coins and other new elements that are entering crypto right now. I would love to have this talk in a few months. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Sure, Michael. It's been fun. Happy to come back sometime.
Perfect.
Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by Cyvers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. Cyvers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.